What was your biggest "oh no, they weren't joking" moment? Story 1. My school, for some reason, announced they were millions of dollars in debt and were going to be lowering the budget on April Fools. Everyone, obviously, laughed, even the teachers. Then the next day the deans talked about it again and everyone was like, wait, what? Teachers resigned. Story 2. I went for a job interview in the middle of winter on a frigid blizzardy day. The guy to interview me was late from the inclement weather, so I was waiting a while in the reception area. Finally he came in and said something like brrrr, sorry I'm late. It's so cold out there my car wouldn't start. I laughed thinking the stutter was a joke like they do in cartoons and stuff. Nope, guy had a bad stutter. Luckily he saw my horrified face when I realized and he thought it was hilarious. Story 3. I went to a Halloween party and an acquaintance of mine who only had one arm from a hunting accident came as Captain Hook. He was standing there eating his food with one hand when someone who didn't know him said, I guess you didn't think about having to eat with one hand when you decided to come as a pirate. Story 4. My soon-to-be mother-in-law making a joke about joining us on our honeymoon. Surely she isn't being serious? Oh yes. Yes she was. She was totally going to buy tickets and room accommodations where we were going, and was planning on surprising us with this visit. It only came out once she decided not to go through with it. It took a lot of effort to keep my face looking normal in that moment. Story 5. For me, it occurred when I was young enough that I had to be told they weren't joking. My parents got divorced before I even entered grade school, and I saw my father very rarely at first. Usually just a couple weeks over the summer. We would spend a week with his family and then a week in his home in the big city. I was 11, and my dad asked if I would like go over to my aunt's house to play with my cousins, or if I would like to hang out at Grandpa's, where my dad was just going to be taking a nap, or maybe going to see some old friends of his. Obviously he wanted me to choose the former, but I was too young to see it, and I said that I wanted to hang out with him. He got quite frustrated, explaining he wasn't going to be doing anything, and I replied that I knew, but I still wanted to. He then said, you are such a pain in the ass, sometimes. To which I smiled and said I know. And he said I'm not joking. Oh. Okay. So I went with my aunt and cousin back to their house, riding in the back of their truck with their dog. And I distinctly remember petting the dog and saying I bet your dad doesn't think you're a pain in the ass, through tears. This may not seem like much, but I only saw him for a couple weeks out of every year. No calls and few letters. And here it is, 4 decades later, and I'm still feeling it. Story 6. My sister who is a drug addict had her baby in prison, so she had the man she said to be the father and his family pick my nephew up from the hospital. They decided to do a DNA test and called us on April 1st, told us the DNA test came back that his wasn't their son's baby, and we had 2 hours to come get my nephew and everything they bought or they would drop him off at DHS. We laughed at first thinking this is an odd April Fool's joke, but the guy's mom was not laughing and told us she was very serious. Needless to say we had to go pick up my nephew. Story 7. A few weeks ago my 5-year-old told me he was going to piss on the carpet. I figured he was doing it to get attention in the form of an angry reaction from me, so I decided to call him out on his bluff and told him, if you really think that kind of behavior will help you accomplish anything, go ahead. Long story short, any tips for getting piss smell out of the carpet? Story 8. I worked as a cashier at a shooting range in college. A guy came off the range, up to me fairly calmly and said, could you call 911? My buddy got hit in the neck. It was spoken so matter-of-factly that I just kind of laughed. To which he replied, no, really, could you? Then his buddy walked past my register towards the bathrooms holding his bleeding neck, and suddenly the mood shifted a bit. Story 9. My friend who's a couple years older than me was telling us last year that he's reached the age now where people he grew up with are dying, so I gave a bit of a chuckle, because I thought he was joking about the fact that he was 21 and the rest of us were 18. Then he showed us a video of his friend's funeral in Ghana. Turns out his friend was killed in a robbery. Story 10. My husband had a best friend he lived near as a young kid, and as they got older and went places PPL would say they looked alike and they would always tell everyone that they were cousins. They got tired of hearing about how they looked so much alike. Here we are 35 years later and my stepson does a 23 and me and shows that my husband's best friend is his uncle. Long story short, my husband and his best friend are brothers. They share the same dad. The dad was spreading his seed all over the small town he lived in. My poor husband was led to believe his dad that raised him was his real dad. My Phil has since passed and my husband would never tell him he knew. He was such a great man for raising him knowing he wasn't his child. Story 10. My husband had a best friend he lived near as a young kid, and as they got older and went places, PPL would say they looked alike and they would always tell everyone that they were cousins. They got tired of hearing about how they looked so much alike. Here we are 35 years later and my stepson does a 23andMe and shows that my husband's best friend is his uncle. Long story short, my husband and his best friend are brothers. They share the same dad. The dad was spreading his seed all over the small town he lived in. My poor husband was led to believe his dad that raised him was his real dad. My Phil has since passed and my husband would never tell him he knew. He was such a great man for raising him knowing he wasn't his child. Story 11. Definitely not the biggest one but a funny one for sure. Had a job ticket come in to dim the sun with a name and no other info. We all got a laugh. A month later we get a call that we did not do a request. Yep, it was to dim the sun. Now you think it would maybe be that their blinds were not closing or the window tint had an issue. No, when we got there they didn't want to close their blinds, they wanted the sun to be actually dim because it was not that bright when they started working in that office. I had to walk away like literally speechless. We eventually had to talk to their manager and clarify that we could not dim the sun and that the request was unreasonable.